What is your creative process? How do we as artists navigate taking that vision that's in our head and bringing it to life? Sometimes all it starts with is a few scribbles that take you down the creative process, ultimately leading you to the final product. It's the Lily Factor! Ding! The universal first step behind any creative process is the vision. And once you have a vision, now you have to decide how to put it to action. For the vision I had in my head for this particular illustration, I knew that it would constantly require me to resize things, including the characters within the scene, to match the perspective I had in mind. I also knew that I wanted to work on a good color contrast, which meant I would have to recolor things constantly. In order to best do that, I knew I needed to make it a digital painting. That way I could resize things without harming the integrity of the piece and recolor things, once again, without harming the integrity of the piece. Once you've decided how to bring your vision to life, then it comes down to actually just plain getting started. The vision that led to the process behind this illustration is a concept I had in mind involving the hero protagonist fleeing from the robotic villain antagonist who's trying to smack him with a giant lollipop. This is a continuation of another illustration that I've shared the process for in the past, featuring one of the worlds from Sonic Colors, Sonic himself, and one of the bosses from Sonic Colors. So the idea of this illustration is to see Sonic fleeing from a lollipop smackdown, courtesy of Captain Jelly, down the murky waters of Sweet Factory, which is the candy factory themed world. The robot is like a pirate robot with candy trim on his coat and a giant lollipop. And now that that's established, this was the first pass for the illustration, and I did not stick to it. I ended up starting over, not because I didn't like the drawing, but because it wasn't conveying the overall feeling I wanted to express in the piece, which was that the villain is huge compared to the hero, which was a struggle to figure out that perspective. So I tried to lower the horizon line, the eye level, so that the villain's kind of towering over the character to make it seem bigger. But I overall needed a reference photo, so I started with one figure that still wasn't small enough compared to Waffles the Coyote representing our villain, and I used a little remote control to represent the lollipop, so I'd know how to get that in perspective, to overall make it seem like the lollipop is huge, the villain is huge, our hero is small and barely making it out in time. And while that reference photo shouldn't look anything like the final product of the illustration, it helped me get the idea of how that angle should look, how things should be placed. Because even with perspective grids, that doesn't mean it's going to help you figure out how to scale the objects or the characters in a way to express the size you want to convey. And now knowing that in order to make the villain seem bigger in the viewpoint by lowering the horizon line and having a reference photo on the side helped me to make this rough sketch the final rough sketch to get the illustration started. So that way I was able to start blocking out colors for the scene, adding in the water and two suns because they're in space, different planets, different worlds, so they can have two suns and nobody can stop me. You might notice that as I'm adding in colors, I'm not erasing any of the weird extra sketch lines like that neon green or the red or the blue. There's a reason for that, and that is part of what I've decided to be my creative process. I don't do it for every illustration, but I've been doing it for some of these kind of illustrations, and it helps me carry along with the idea, no matter how daunting or intimidating it may be. By not erasing all of the extra sketch lines, it gives me the opportunity to keep the illustration nice and loose and free and give me the chance to paint over it and refine those details later on. Now, since this is a digital piece and I want the scene to be kind of set up at nighttime, but the sun is just starting to rise. So how I managed to create all the colors I've laid out into a darker atmosphere, making it that sunrise, almost golden hour look, is by taking an extra layer, filling it with just like a dark saturated blue or purple, setting it to multiply and lightening the opacity, which you saw me do, and then I erased some things to give it an extra sense of light. That helped me get a sense of the mood of lighting for the scene, which gave me the opportunity to start refining the details and sharpening up the overall image by just going in and drawing some colors over everything, making details more clear, sharpening everything up so that all those extra sketch lines you saw before are now starting to become less sketchy, less random, more intentional. But you can still keep some of them in there, and it creates a neat color, neat texture, neat look. One that's not easily replicated because it wasn't precise, but more creatively free, like a true artist. Let the paintbrush fly. So touching back on what I talked about at the beginning, I've already talked about how I wanted to improve on like the perspective and angle, but I also talked about working on color contrast in this piece. Basically, something I always struggle with is color contrast. Because I'm a detail and color junkie, I tend to go a little overboard with details and colors. I am aware I'm getting the help I need, but I tend to go overboard, and it overall helps me lose sight of the initial vision where I lose contrast. So if I create an illustration, I add too many details, and the character I drew in the center of the illustration suddenly does not stand out. If you were to zoom out or just look at it for the first 5 seconds, it would take your eyes some time to adjust, but then you would see the character. And you just can't always have it like that. Especially if you're trying to visually communicate a story, you want the contrast there. You want to be the puppet master telling the audience's eyes to look in a specific place. So in order to better do that is think more intentionally about the color scheme, the lighting. At this time, I had just finished reading Windows into Worlds, The Art of Devin L. Kurtz. Her book talks about how she creates contrast in her illustrations. And it was very helpful reading this book to give me more ideas on how I could better convey color contrast. She talked about a difference between warm tones and cool tones and how you can use that for contrast. Basically, blue and orange together, eyes are drawn naturally more to orange. It's the warm tone, whereas the cool tones kind of pull the eye away. So this illustration was a perfect way to practice that because the characters are made up of cool tones and the world around them is made up of warm tones. And because I knew that helped me think more intentionally about how everything was set up in terms of both character placement and the lighting setup. But I still have a lot to learn, so another technique I learned from the book in order to make sure I still had contrast there was to create a black layer, set it to hue on top of everything else, and that way I could see everything in black and white in order to figure out if everything still had contrast even without color. So looking at it for the first time, I noticed that our main hero in the front and center of the illustration was lost. So first, I brightened his colors overall so that in grayscale, he still stood out. Of course, at the beginning, having him brightened now in color, it didn't look quite right. It didn't really match the lighting, but that isn't the end of the world. That means I can just go in and start adding more on top of the character to match it to the scene, but now in grayscale, the character is still bright enough to stand out in the illustration, even without color. So it helped me kind of reprogram my brain to figure out how to make the characters stand out in the illustration, even without color contrast, but also with color contrast. The more you know, the more you learn. That's the beauty of making illustrations, challenging yourself every time, is there's always something new to learn, always something new to explore. It's all part of the process, even the exploration, even the learning curve. As I'm wrapping up this illustration, I'm adding fire underneath the robot, and because that's how the robot flies, and making sure that light's apparent in the water. Also adding little static lines to give it a good motion blur on our speedy little character there. And then I do believe I add some blue around him later to give him that boost look. Yeah, there it is. Just like in the game. Now entering the final part of the process is adding all the little details to really pull the piece together, and that's the freedom we have, is to decide whatever that may be. I decided the crowning touch should be adding color-filled squares all around the illustration to give it kind of a pixelated look without harming the pixel count of the illustration, to pay homage to Sonic Colors on the DS, where things were a little more pixelated than they are now. You see, back in my day, we saw everything in pixels, not black and white. And just like that, the illustration is finished. Thank you for coming along as we explored elements of the creative process and watching how those elements went into creating this illustration. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and may God bless you in your life and your art. Bye!